Again, welcome to Freedom. It's so good to see you here today, and we welcome in those who are joining us online. We appreciate you tuning in that way. Just before we get into the Word, if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and be turning with me. We'll continue in 2 Samuel. We'll be in chapter 21 if you want to go ahead and be turning there. Begin with a little bit of good news. As you know, this coming Sunday we'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary as a church here at Freedom Church, the Fairhope campus. But the following Sunday, the 28th of August, on the two Ida campuses, for those of you who aren't, or maybe you're new to Freedom, Freedom is one church that exists in 4 locations on 2 continents. 3 of those locations are in Africa. The 2 most recent church plants are in Ida, Nigeria, and those 2 campuses will be celebrating their first anniversary on the 28th. And it is amazing the growth that they've seen in 1 year's time, but it's going to be more than an anniversary celebration. It's going to be the grand opening of the new building, which really is mind-boggling to consider that it's only been about 26 months since we first began to plant in the middle of a pandemic in Sapele, Nigeria, and how in just over 2 years' time, God has let 3 churches be birthed there, and so many people be reached. Already this morning, there have been more than 1,200 people worshiping in Freedom Church locations in Nigeria. And to consider that on top of the people who are reached, through the gifts of the people in our little congregation, and I mean, it's not like there's some other source. What God's doing through Freedom in Nigeria is coming just from this little fellowship, and God has used you to buy the land and to build 2 brand new buildings debt-free in the midst of a pandemic over the last 2 years. God is good. That's extraordinary. I mean, it's just almost crazy. And so they are thrilled to be moving. You know, in the main campus in Ida, they've been meeting under a tent. And in case you don't know, it is hot in Nigeria all the time. So they're going to get to move into that space. But more than just moving into the new building, they are praying and fasting for a great day of harvest on that day. They're excited about a lot of things. And I wish that I had thought to have the pictures available to show you on the screen, but you'll see 1 or 2 of those in the newsletter. But one of the things that is such a blessing on the new campus, just as we were able to do in Sapele, we've been able to do in Ida, a well has been dug and big tanks, big cisterns have been installed. The church is now the clean water source for that community. The city is unable to provide clean water for the people. So when people want clean water, they come to Freedom Church. There's no other church that's able to provide that. So that is such a tangible thing. And so on the 28th, they're going to be sharing lots of food with people who are in need and giving out special gifts to every Muslim who is in attendance. On that day, we've seen so many Muslims get saved over the course of the past year, more than 100 who have converted from Islam to Christianity in 1 year's time. This is just unheard of. And so, I mean, I have chills thinking about so many coming to Christ in this way. I mean, it's one thing for people to come out of the black magic and the tribal religions. We see those in bigger numbers, but Muslims coming to Christ like this, they are saying again and again that they find hope where they haven't had hope in Islam, and that they're finding joy and meaning through the message that they're hearing about Christ. So we celebrate those things, and Isaiah has asked that we would please be in prayer and fasting toward that Sunday. It's 2 weeks away, so would you join me every day in covering that? We want the Lord to get glory, but we want to see people be reached through that. So we just feel like this is a new open door opportunity. So I wanted to start by sharing that with you. With that said, today we're going to be talking about changing seasons. Now here's something you didn't wake up on Sunday morning thinking about, but do you ever just pause to consider one of those little quirks that the Big Bang does not explain? This is one of those things that science trips over, but if the Big Bang could adequately try to explain everything, you have a hard time explaining why the Earth, that should be spinning like a top on an axis that's perpendicular to all the other planets and the sun, that plane, but the Earth doesn't do that. It doesn't spin like a top like this. It spins at a 23.5-degree angle. And because it does, life is so very different. Because it spins on this 23.5-degree angle as we rotate around the sun, where the sun hits the Earth most directly, moves up up and down the planet through the different months of the year with the net effect of what? The changing seasons. It makes life what it is. If you fell into a coma 6 months ago on Valentine's Day and woke up today, you'd have come to church poorly dressed, wouldn't you? If you came in today thinking it was February 14th instead of August 14th, you'd have been in deep trouble in the balmy South because of the changing of seasons. We love that. We love how much that does for us. God is a God of, we think about the unchanging nature of God, but God is a God of constantly changing things. He created a dynamic world in which we lived, and the changing of seasons has always been a part of God's design. Well, that's not just true for the planet as it spins on its axis. God has made us for changing seasons in life. And your ability to recognize the season that you're in and to adapt with the changing of the seasons is going to have a lot to do with how well you live out your life and whether or not you continue well and finish well. Because a lot of us by nature just, we like for things not to change. I mean, we tend to think that way, don't we? Like, we get in a groove and we don't want anybody messing with our groove, do we? We just like it when we feel like we've got it figured out, and the few changes that we imagine are going to happen, we like to know in advance that they're coming, don't we? I mean, we imagine, I want to learn a trade, I want to learn to do a thing for a career, and then I want to do it for X number of years, and then I want to quit doing it, and I want retirement to look like this. And we think life's going to be that way, and it almost never works out that way, does it? It's never that stable and predictable. Life is going to come with the changing of seasons, and your ability to recognize the changes and how you're going to have to change with it will have a lot to do with how well you continue on and finish in life. We've been looking at the life of the second half of the life of King David, and what we're going to get down to today is the last decade of his life and how he had to adjust with the changing seasons. I want to begin, though, with a passage that was written by David's son Solomon, the wisest man ever to live, and in Ecclesiastes, he wrote these very familiar words, some of the most familiar words that Solomon ever wrote. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time of peace. Somebody should write a song about that. True words. Solomon is just reminding us, your life is going to be filled with changing seasons. Are you paying attention, and are you adjusting to that? Well, what we're going to read today in 2 Samuel 21 gives us a glimpse of, just in real life, what the changing of seasons can mean for you. We pick up in verse 15, where it says, once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. And we're going, yeah, we know this. We know, this is the next verse of a familiar song. I mean, this is what David has been doing for his entire adult life, hasn't it? He's been battling the Philistines. Where did he get his start? Remember when he's a teenager? Who was it that Goliath was a part of? He was a part of the Philistine army. Throughout his career, David has been going into battle against the Philistines, and his track record is great. He whips these people again and again and again. This is where so much of his fame has come from. So now, here's David. He's no longer a teenager. He's 60 or in his 60s. And it's like, all right, we're going to have to go show him one more time who's in charge. We know how to handle this, done this, been there, done that before. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines. That's what he always does. But catch this line. And he became exhausted. Somebody in the room should say, that's right, amen, or oh me. There's a line that you can identify with, isn't it? I mean, we cheer for David in all of his victories, but isn't there a little bit of disconnect for you when you look at a character like David where every time he goes to battle, he comes out on top and we go, man, good for David, but that's not my story. I mean, don't you feel like that? Like, I've been in plenty of battles, and some I've won and some I've lost. I can't relate to the guy who always seems to win, but I can relate to the guy who goes into battle, and in the middle of the battle, he's exhausted. We don't mean like, I need to just take a minute and catch my breath. We're talking about out of gas, on the ground, exhausted. That's a problem. And Ishbi-Benob. Now, if you're trying to pick out a baby name, there's one that's available to you right there. Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels. Okay, the point, 300 shekels, that's 7.5 pounds. This is a whopper of a guy. This is Andre the Giant here. Big man. He was armed also with a new sword, and he said that he would kill David. Do you get the scene in your mind? Do not think modern warfare. David, the commander of the army, he is not calling the orders from the Pentagon. He is not back in an armored command post. He's not even in his Humvee in the field. This is ancient battle where the king is in the middle of the fighting. He's the one that if he can't use his sword to defend himself and defeat the enemy, he's going to die. And unfortunately, David is learning a hard lesson a little bit late. Men in their 60s don't need to go into battle. Those are the guys who tend the camp. David does not have an army of men in their 50s and 60s. The young men go in and do this. And David, in the middle of the battle, is to the point, he not only is at a place he can't defeat the enemy, he can't even defend himself. Can you picture this guy in his 60s? He is out of gas. He is on the ground just panting for air. And the biggest, baddest guy from the other side sees that. The Philistines have known for decades, if we're ever going to overcome the Israelites, there's one thing we've got to do. We've got to one day get to David and kill David. And this guy with a fantastic name, who's a giant, big, big man, goes, today's the day and I'm the man. I'm about to kill the king. And it looks like it's about to happen. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, remember Zeruiah, he was the helped to head the personal guard of the king there, but it's his son, came to David's rescue, and he struck the Philistine down and killed him. And then, here's the important thing, David's men swore to him, saying, never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished. Can you just feel the weight of that moment for David? There's never been a moment since he was a teenager that he has not been the most famous, most courageous warrior in all the land. And now for the first time, all of his trusted soldiers and leaders look at him and say, sir, this is the last time you will ever march out on the field with us. It's not because we don't trust you. It's just that time has passed you by. Not only do you no longer have the strength to lead us, we're at the place you're going to be a liability in the field. You had to be saved today rather than what's always happened, which is you saving the day for everyone else. Can you just feel the weight of that for David? This thing that has defined you for 4.5 decades is over. You will never again be the warrior king that you've been. And now just very quickly, notice the next 4 little short paragraphs. In the course of time, there was another battle of the Philistines at Gobe. And this time, Sibbecai the Hushite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. All that we're fixing to read about are people in this one little family line among the Philistines who were genetic freaks. These guys would have all been stars in the NBA and the NFL today. They were just bigger than everyone else. They were scary on the battlefield. And so this guy wins that battle. In another battle, the Philistines in Gobe, Elhanan, son of Jair, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. And still another battle, which took place at Gath. There was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. I told you these are genetic kind of freaks here. 24 in all. and he was also a descendant of Rapha. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, killed him. So it's David's nephew who's the hero that day. These four were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they all fell at the hands of David and his men. And when we read that, what we recognize is the writer is being generous, because the truth of the matter is all of these big bad boys fell at the hands of somebody not named David. Do you get the change that has happened here? The writer is being gentle in what he's saying, but he's driving home a key point. One last time, David goes out to lead the army to a great victory, but guess what happens? David doesn't have any gas left in the tank for that, and he has to be saved. And then there's another battle, and another battle, and another battle, and guess who the hero was in every one of those battles? In all four of these battles, guess who the heroes were? They were all people not named David. They were young men. It was David's nephew. It was the son of the guy who had been a companion of David. All of the heroic actions are being taken on by the next generation. And David is having to come to terms with the fact that God has a different role for him in the season of life that he now finds himself in. This happens to every one of us. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, this is going to be a depressing message. This is just a message about getting old and not having anything important to do. It's not. Today is an encouraging word. Bear with me, because what we're going to find is the final decade of David's reign, in my opinion, was probably the most important and most effective decade of his entire life. I think David was the best king out of the 40 years that he reigned in the final 10 years that he reigned. And it was a season when he wasn't going out into the field fighting battles. God had other roles for him, and they were really important. David didn't sort of wither up and just sort of fade into the sunset through the final decade. David led in new ways to do new things that were so important, because he adjusted with the changing seasons. Now, if you want to pull out your outlines, there are really just three things that I want you to take notice of today, and they're pretty straightforward. What we want to consider is how it is that David thrived through the changing seasons and even in the later part of his life so that he finished well. He thrived by doing three things. First of all, by scaling back certain activities and by being careful to take care of himself. I mean, the passage we just read gives you a picture of that, doesn't it? So what did David scale back? Not a trick question. What did David scale back at this point in his life? The going out onto the battlefield, being the soldier who straps on his sword and says, I'm going to lead from the front of the lines. He's like, nope, not going to be able to continue to do that. I'm going to have to say no to some things that I've really enjoyed doing. I mean, okay, it's a bloody thing. There's a part of us that has a hard time equating that kind of bloody, kill the bad guys leadership with being a man of God, and yet it was a role that David thrived in. He was good at it, and he's going to have to say no to that, scaling that back and taking care of himself. That's what his men closest to him said. Sir, we need you to stop doing that because we can't take the risk that we would lose you. You are too important. The lamp of Israel must not be snuffed out. We need you. We just need you in a different role. There are a lot of us in the room that are going to need to come to terms with that thought, that God has an evolving role for us, a changing role, but it's no less an important role. Now, it's interesting to back up and reconsider for a moment a passage that we read a couple of weeks ago where David was having to deal with the civil war in Israel, and he sent his troops out, and it says in 2 Samuel 18, he sent out a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, and a third under Ittai. And the king told the troops, I myself will march out with you, but the men said, you must not go. They went on to explain why they didn't want him to go out into battle that day. They were afraid he was going to get killed that day. And the king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. Now, here we are sometime later down the line, and we're having to sort of repeat that conversation. Do you get a feel for what's taking place here? what we just read to begin with isn't the first time they've had to say this to the king. But the king didn't fully grasp it. He's just like, okay, today I don't get to go out to battle, but I'm going to go out next time. What we read about today was the moment where reality sinks in and David's going, oh, that wasn't just a one-time thing. I'm never going out to fight those battles again. I have to accept this is a different season for me. It's really important for us, and especially for the guys in the room, but it's true for men and women. It is really important that we never confuse our career with our identity, and that we never let our career define our identity. And as men, we are bad about doing that. And I can't think of any career that guys ever are in where we're worse about that than what I do. And it gets fed by people who just, if they know you're a pastor, then that's all you are in so many people's minds. I mean, to a point, it really is almost comical. If you could just walk in my shoes for a week, I'm not saying it as a complaint, but it is just almost silly how many times I'll be in these situations. Jackie and I were with brand new friends for dinner a couple of weeks ago, and this, I can't count how many times this has happened in my life. So one of the couples, it's only the second time we've been out with them, and the other two couples, it's the first time. So the couple that we sort of knew, as people are arriving, it's like, this happens all the time. People have got to give the warning. He's a preacher, so watch what you say. The first time we went out with the couple, she went ahead and announced as soon as they sat down at the table, I already told my husband, you're a preacher, he needs to clean up his language tonight. Don't talk like he normally talks. Because, preachers have virgin ears. We've never heard bad words or anything. We don't know what those words mean. It's really weird how much you start feeling like your career is your identity. I want to tell you, I work really hard against that. I'm a pastor, sure. I love that God called me to do this. I love that I have the privilege of doing this. But I want you to be really clear about this. It's not who I am. It's what I do. It's part of what I do. And I won't do it forever. I mean, I hope God lets me do it for a lot more years, but there's going to come a day, most likely, this isn't going to be what I do. And I am a person outside of the role of what I do, just like you are. And we need to really come to grips with that our career does not define who we are. There are just certain careers particularly that are notorious for defining us. I think doctors struggle a lot with this. Think about how we look at doctors and talk about doctors, and it just defines them. And ladies, you're not immune to this. Lots of ladies, it seems to me in particular, who really embrace the wonderful high calling of getting to be a stay-at-home mom, and who love that and thrive in that. But if that becomes your identity, it creates a terrible crisis, doesn't it, when you get to that stage in life where you don't have little ones who are depending on you. And when they leave and suddenly your identity is lost, if you let yourself buy into that being your identity. Never confuse those things. Never be defined by what you do. It's a little bit of a sobering thought, but I think we ought to just back up sometimes and get a big picture perspective on our lives. I was thinking about it this week, and if you just measure by average life expectancy, guess what this year meant for me? This year began the final third of my life. I'm 54. Just by the numbers, statistically, this year I began the final third of my life. It's 2/3 done. There are a lot of you in the room who are in that final third with me. Some of you are going, I got a different fraction going on right here, but you can figure out your own fraction. I'm not going to try and define you. I know God's timing is what it is, but at some point, you just have to realize, okay, the number of years I have left is less than the number of years I have already experienced. I don't think I'm unsafe in saying that about myself. It's important to just have some sense of where we are in this journey. And especially when you've got less years ahead of you than behind you, there are some things we better be thinking about. We better be proactive. And so I'm just going to offer this kind of quickly as just, if you want to follow in your outlines, 3 practical words, especially for those of us in the room who recognize we're in the final third of life. Three things that I consider from David's lesson here, and the first one is this: make physical health and adequate rest consistent priorities. David was entering a season where he could not physically do what he had been doing. He's exhausted. He's going to have to pull back and stop demanding as much of himself. When you get to the later decades of your life, one of the things that starts to catch up with you is the realization we took health for granted when we were in our teens and 20s and 30s, didn't we? I mean, you could just go wide open, you could burn the candle at both ends, and it never seemed to have any ill effects on you. That does not work anymore on the other side of 50 and 60. It just doesn't. You can't do all the things that you used to do, so you better make some adjustments. Make some adjustments to get the rest. Now, here's the depressing side of the rest thing. Researchers tell you it takes you more hours in bed to get less sleep the older you get. There are people in the room going, that's right. It takes you a longer amount of time in bed to get less hours of sleep. So you have to be intentional to get the rest, to get the exercise. And okay, here's a word that's not scriptural. This is just me being your pastor. When you get to this stage of life, don't be foolish. Go to the doctor on a regular basis. Check the things that ought to be checked. Ladies, go get your mammograms. Guys, go get the things checked you ought to get checked. You know what they are. I'm not going to tell you, but you know what they are. Get your levels checked. Find out how you're doing. Make sure, and it is kind of crazy. I mean, I'm in that stage now where I feel like, it's silly. I'm healthy. I shouldn't be going to the doctor multiple times per year, but we do. If you're going to take care of yourself, getting your checkup, making sure your blood pressure and your cholesterol is where it should be, getting checked for skin cancer for those of us who've lived our whole lives outdoors. I mean, my goodness, last Sunday afternoon, we buried a dear, dear friend. And do you know where Opal's troubles began? 3.5 years ago, with a spot of melanoma, a skin cancer that metastasized and ultimately took over her whole body and took her life. And if she were here, she would tell you, go to your dermatologist, get checked out, do the things to take care of yourself. Good grief, I have a sleep doctor I have to see once a year now. It's silly, some of the things that we have to do. Welcome to the last third of life. But the bottom line is, go check the things that you can check to make sure that you get to make the most of every day that God has planned for you here on earth. And don't use your faith and spirituality as an excuse to not do your part. I mean, I hear some people who are like, well, I'm just trusting Jesus. I don't fool with that stuff. Well, do you put your seatbelt on when you get in the car? Don't you trust Jesus? You do your part. Buckle your seatbelt and trust Jesus when you're driving down the road. Go to your doctor, get checked for what you ought to get checked for, and trust Jesus with your health. Amen? Okay, so we're going to do what we can to make health and all a priority. Secondly, prioritize your schedule around your values. When you recognize that you're going through sort of a transitional time to a next season, those are always good checkpoints to take a step back and say, obviously, I've got to make some adjustments and use those as reset moments to say, what are my priorities and how can I now adjust my schedule so that I'm spending time on the things that I value? What do you value? I want a close personal relationship with Jesus that is not secondhand. So I want a schedule that allows me that opportunity. I want close relationships with my wife, with my closest friends, with my small group family, so I'm going to adjust my schedule accordingly. Think about what you really value. Get clear about those things and set your schedule around those as you're realizing I've got to make changes and I've got to say no to some things. And that brings us to the last thing, which is learn to say no to good things to leave room for the best things. The fact of the matter is, David probably didn't recognize it at the time when he's being told, you don't get to go out to the battlefield anymore. He probably just in the moment feels the sense of loss of, oh my goodness, I'm getting older and I don't get to do that anymore. What he's about to discover, that we're going to see in just a few minutes, is God has new things that are going to be exciting and important, but he doesn't have room for those unless he says no to what he has been accustomed to doing. You and I have to get good at saying no to the good so that we have room to say yes to the best. And I've been having to practice this lately. Can I just share personally out of that. So here's one from this week. I was telling, I think, John this morning. And I know this is going to sound small to you, but okay, part of the realization for me is I'm more of a people pleaser than I want to admit. You know, it's hard to say no to people because I don't want to disappoint anyone. Anybody else struggle with that? Okay, it's just me, but I struggle with that. So one of the things that I've always done is anybody basically that ever asked me to do a wedding, so long as you're willing to agree to X number of months of doing counseling with me and, you know, do the whole process with me, I would do your wedding. Well, the longer that I have lived and the longer that I've done ministry, I'm at the realization the things that God has me investing in, I don't have unlimited years left in my life, and I don't have unlimited hours in my week, and I don't have room for just everything that I've said yes to in the past. And so one of the boundaries that I've been setting in the past year is having to say no when people make requests from outside the church. Hey, would you come and do this family wedding for us? And so, sure enough, this week I had a lady from outside the church who got my number, contacted me. Hey, my daughter's getting married in October. Will you do the wedding? And, you know, I appreciate that they thought of me and asked me to do that. But it's that evaluation thing. The pleaser in me wants to go, sure, of course, I'll do that. And yet it's like, but I feel like this is a boundary I was supposed to put in place. And I wrestled with that for a couple of days. What it ultimately came down to is reminding myself, if I say yes to everybody out in the community that asks for those kinds of pieces, because it's not just an hour or two of time, it's multiple counseling sessions over multiple months, plus basically Friday and Saturday of the wedding weekend. And I finally had to follow through and say, I appreciate you asking, but no, I'm not going to be able to do that. I reserve that time for the church family and for the families of the people who attend this church. I'm ultimately your pastor, which means I'm going to prioritize you and my family even above the community at large. I know that sounds small to you probably, but that's an important boundary. And yet it was hard to do, to say no, because I'm like, I know I'm disappointing someone. I'll tell you another one that's going to maybe sound silly to you, but it's in line with what we're looking at today. One of the things that Jackie and I have always done, each of us did before we were ever married to each other, and now we've done together as a couple, is our yard is our responsibility. I feel like everybody in our old neighborhood had professionals do it, but we had our own equipment. We did our own yard. Well, most of you know, last October we moved to Daphne, and where we moved to is we have 3 acres of property. But it's not 3 acres of grassy property. It is 3 acres of very challenging property with all kinds of, I wish you could just ride a lawnmower over it, and you can't. And we're like, we can do this. We can handle this. And so this summer's been our first growing season to try and tackle that. And I'll never forget the first day, once everything was really growing, that we spent the day out there trying to battle everything that was there and then spending days recovering from that day. And we didn't make it too far into the summer before we started looking at each other and going, can we keep on doing this? And we finally pulled the trigger within the last month and said, we give up. We can't do this anymore. We can't be the ones to do this thing. And I think maybe for guys, it's more of a pride thing. It was kind of hard to make that call to professionals and to think, we're going to spend how much money to have other people come in and take care of our yard? But you know what? We're going to do it. We signed the contract. And I'm over the ego thing, and now I'm kind of going, how soon can they get here and take this over? Because you can't just do everything you've always done. What you do for a season, you can't assume that you should do it for a lifetime. And there's some liberation on getting over some things to say, that's not something I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Figuring out what needs to change with the changing seasons. Another just really small example, and some of you can relate to this. All the years of my life as an adult, when we would gather with family of origin for Christmas, it's always a huge feast, always a huge meal, umpteen hours of preparation for that. Feels like about that many hours cleaning up from it. And the realization with all of us getting older, this is crazy. Why do we spend the limited time we have at the holidays doing this? So, the decision we made a couple of years ago, forget it. It's time for that to come to an end. We'll eat out, we'll carry out, we'll whatever, but we're not going to put the generation ahead of us and us through spending all of our time in the holidays cooking and cleaning up when the thing that we really value is the limited, precious time that we get together. Maybe those seem like silly examples that aren't important, but there are in your life situations where you need to take a step back and evaluate and say, are there things that I'm doing or that we're doing as a family that worked in the past, but they don't really suit us well for today and for the future, that we need to just go, why don't we just let that go? There's a different way that we could do this, and life would really have more margin, and we could really do the things that matter the most to us. I'll say one other application, and then I'll quit meddling. At least for a moment I will. Here's one of those things that with the changing of seasons that we have to let go of, that some of us in my generation have not been really good at, is taking care of our children. Some of us are slow to recognize that the changing of seasons have to do with us and with the generation that we have been so tied to behind us, that we lose sight of the goal, that the goal is to raise them up, kids that came into the world totally dependent on us, and raise them up to be adults who no longer depend on us for anything and who depend on God for everything. And when we lose sight of that, when our kids are grown, we keep doing this. We keep shelling out the money so that sometimes we put ourselves in a bad place that we can't even live the life that we should be living because we're so committed to paying for the lifestyles of our adult children. Recognizing the changing seasons of life means not only that you recognize it in yourself, that you pay attention to your children and the stages that we should realize it's time that they take responsibility. And even if they don't have a plan, that it's obvious how they're going to work it out, that we still just go, but you know what? We all have to figure those things out. And we step back and go, in the next season, I'm not your supply, I'm not your support, I'll pray for you and love you. You with me? Yeah, that one got somber there. That getting a little too close to home? That's a part of wouldn't you agree that's a part of the normal, healthy, changing seasons of life? It changes how we operate as parents. Okay, let's get over that one. Everybody take a deep breath. Let it out. All right, moving on to the next thing. Second thing that David did, and this is where it gets good, is he thrived through the changing seasons by embracing the new roles that God had for him. What did that look like? You recognize, don't you, that the books of Chronicles are a retelling of Samuel and Kings. So what happens is you read these parallel accounts where you get details or extra little stories added in that you find out more about the same season. So Chronicles is telling us a lot of the stories we read in Samuel, but it adds in some other things. So part of what we read about this same season, the final decade of David's reign, it says in 1 Chronicles 22, then David said, the house of the Lord God is to be here, and also the altar of burnt offerings for Israel. Here's a really important thing that God put on David's heart as he got to the later season of his life. That his life was no longer going to be centered on conquering the enemy and expanding territory and protecting territory, that instead it was going to be about the relationship of people to God, the worship of God, having a place of worship, a place for God to display his glory to his people, and the building of the temple was going to be front and center for David, one of the most important things. So David gave orders to assemble the foreigners residing in Israel, and from among them he appointed stonecutters to prepare stones for building the house of God, and he provided a large amount of iron to make nails for the doors and more bronze that could be weighed. He provided more cedar logs than could be counted. And David said to Solomon, I have taken great pains to provide the temple for the temple of the Lord, 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver, quantities of bronze and iron, too great to be weighed, as well as wood and stone. Now, again, I realize that we are not experts in ancient weights and measures, so let me just add a little clarity to that. David is now taking the gifts that he had used as a military leader. And you realize a part of what made David so strong, if you read the accounts of all these battles, part of what was so good about David is not just that he was so courageous, but he was a great tactician. He had the mind of a leader and an organizer, and he knew how to pick out the strengths of leaders and people for different roles. But what David discovers late in his life is those same strengths serve in other ways besides in the military. And so in tackling this project of the temple, he's taking those same skills, but now he's recognizing who are the people that we need to mobilize for the stone cutting, who are the people that we need to mobilize for the financial part of this, and for the woodwork and all of the precious metals work. And now David uses those same organizational skills as a great fundraiser. And so when it talks about all of the incredible numbers of talents of gold and silver, a talent is which is funny, the parable of the talents is never about, we think talents means skill, but in the Bible it means 75 pounds of weight. It's a measure of weight. So let me translate what you just read. When it talks about the gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood that David puts together, David assimilates 7.5 million pounds of gold. Let that sink in. 7.5 million pounds of gold, 75 million pounds of silver. Okay, y'all know I'm a numbers nerd, so let me convert that. I did the math on that in this current values for gold and silver. David raised from among the Israelites, in today's equivalent, he raised $25 billion worth of silver. You want to know how much gold he gathered? $215 billion worth of gold. That's literally how much he put together, not counting the bronze and the iron. Do you realize, when David says to Solomon, I have gone to great pains to provide for the temple, can you imagine raising that much gold and silver, more trees than you could count for the temple? When we talk about this being one of the 7 wonders of the world, there's nothing to compare it to today. What David is preparing, that ultimately he's not going to get to build. We're fixing to read a passage where we realize David knows he doesn't even get to build the temple. Solomon's going to build the temple. He's just spending years preparing for the building of the temple. And oh, by the way, lest you think David was just taxing the people, it goes on to say later what David's contribution to the temple was. Out of his own resources, he contributed $6.5 billion worth of gold and silver. The shepherd boy has come a long way. But he gives out of his own pocket $6.5 billion worth of gold and silver toward this great project. Now in 2 Chronicles 23, it goes on to say, David also gathered together all of the leaders of Israel, as well as their priests and Levites. And David said, of these, 24,000 are to be in charge of the work of the temple of the Lord, 6,000 are to be officials and judges, 4,000 are to be gatekeepers, and 4,000 are to praise the Lord with the musical instruments that I have provided for that purpose. Do you see what he's doing now? He's no longer organizing the army. He's shepherding the whole community. He's evaluating, what do we have here? What are they good at? We're going to designate a lot of people to work on the temple, people to serve in the temple, people to now, instead of fighting to conquer the enemy, we're going to mobilize our resources to lead the people well, to administer justice. We're going to mobilize thousands of people to be gatekeepers and to be in charge of security. Now, no longer fighting the enemy, but just protecting the people of God. And we're going to designate thousands of people whose skill is going to be to play instruments for the glory of God, to sing for the glory of God, and we're going to use a lot of talents to make instruments just to worship God. Do you see how David is shifting the way that he thinks and the way that he operates in a really significant way? He has a different role. For the first time, he's really acting as a king who takes care of the people instead of like a general who's out to conquer the world. And he spends his last decade as his greatest decade of being a king, where they're really living in more peace, and they're able to develop the life of a community together because David leads from a different place. What we're discovering is David had more to offer in the final season of his life than at any other time. And that's an important lesson for us to realize. The further along in life you get, the more you have to give away. I think we've fallen into the trap of a modern American mentality that says, you've got this window of time, and it's kind of somewhere from like early 20s to somewhere in your 60s that are your productive years, and you go, work, make as much money as you can, buy as much house as you can, buy all the toys that you can, and then when you're done, you just quit. You quit working, And the implied thing that happens for lots of people is you sort of quit everything that's responsibility. I'm retired now. So we retire from our job. We retire from our roles in the church and in the kingdom because we're retired folks. And the main job of retired people is we just travel and collect seashells or whatever. I mean, seriously, you've seen what I'm talking about, haven't you? Don't you know people that have thought like that for their whole lives? One of these days, I'm going to get there. I'm going to arrive in the promised land. And I'm just going to retire from everything. And you can't get them to do a blessed thing when people with that mindset arrive at that place. And here's what's upside down about that. By the way, Satan loves that. Satan feeds that mentality. He wants you to think like that because here's what he knows. He knows that you're arriving at a place in life that you have more wisdom, more insight, and more time to give away to make a bigger impact than you've ever made in your entire life. And he wants you to shift in neutral right when you hit that place. He wants you to act like, well, I guess I'm done. God's probably done using me. I've sort of used up my career, so I guess I'll just sort of coast. And that isn't God's plan at all. God is going, we're fixing to hit a new gear. You didn't even realize you've got this gear. We're fixing to take it to a new level because you are positioned. You have learned more than at any other stage in your life. You've got things to impart, and you now have some time that you're not working 40, 50, 60 hours a week on a career that you could really make an investment that matters. That's a cool thing. I love when I think about our church family, looking around the room, and I see the faces of people who reflect what I'm talking about. I think about folks like Ken and Jerry who have arrived at a different stage of life. And these jokers, I'm like, is there any day of the week that you aren't leading a Bible study or going to the nursing home and leading worship? I mean, it's wonderful and crazy how wide open these guys go. Sunday morning, they're leading Bible study in here. Monday night, they're helping Charles and Laura with the Discovery Group next door, leading discipleship during the week, going out doing ministry in the nursing home, leading men's Bible study on Friday out in the community. I mean, just all the time leading because they have arrived at a place of realizing we've got time and wisdom to pass along. Ken spent his time in his life as an attorney. He spent a time in his life as a judge, but when he got through being a judge, he realized, just like Jerry, hey, now I've really got something to give away. I look around the room and I see people like Missy and Jay and Heidi who now are leading a vital ministry in our church, leading in the prayer ministry of this church. I see people like Eileen who spent so much of her life as an RN and now is at a place she's giving her life to missions and serves as our missions pastor, sitting here right here with Cheryl, and who do a fabulous job of shepherding women. And I look at Cheryl and I'm like, good grief, you should be leading the way and teaching people how to lead these small groups where using the gifts. We sat down together just, a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, we're talking about things that you want to do in a small group, but I love being with people who are saying, well, let me tell you what I'm doing she didn't say this, but it's beyond what you've been telling us to do, helping women to discover what their giftedness is and how to use that in ministry. Wisdom that's been accumulated over the years, and now giving that away, a woman at a time. I could just go on and on. It is a beautiful thing to see people realize this stage of life isn't for shifting in neutral and collecting shells. This is the stage for really stepping up and making a difference. I look at my own life, and I'm not moving into retirement mode, but I realize, boy, with the changing of seasons, God has moved me in different directions. There are things I used to spend a lot of time on that I don't spend much time on at all now, and that's freed me up to pursue things for this season of life that's enabled energy to be invested in things like church planting, discipleship, where I get to spend time each week with 3 guys, investing a year at a time with little groups of 3 guys. It's a different kind of ministry. I'll tell you a thing for this season of life that I love is that God has really clearly directed me and Jackie to be very focused on developing relationships with unchurched people. Getting out in the community. There's hardly a week that goes by that we aren't going and meeting unchurched people on their turf to share meals with them and to get to know them. And it's a wonderful thing But you got to say no to some things to have room for the new things that God's going to build in. Embrace the new things that God has for you. Third and final thing that we learn from David about thriving in the different seasons is he did it by empowering new leaders to take on vital roles. David called for his son Solomon, and he charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, but this word of the Lord came to me." And this had to be a painful word. God said, "You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and he is the one who will build a house for my name." And so David goes on to say, "Now, my son, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God as he said you would." How easy would it have been if you or I were in David's shoes to get mad at God and go, God, I want to do this thing for you. I want to build this temple for your glory. I want you to be able to use this as the place that you manifest your glory and the world sees your greatness. I want to do this thing for you. Why will you not let me do this? It would have been easy to get a bad attitude and say, well, forget that. But what did David do? He said, "Solomon, you're the man. God is going to use you, but I realize it's going to be a tremendous undertaking, so I'm going to use the years that I have left raising the money, collecting the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, having the trees felled, having the stones cut. I'm going to make sure that every resource imaginable that you need is going to be there. It's going to be at your disposal, and you're going to get to be the one who assembles that and gets to see the glory fall. I'm not going to be there to see the finished product. I'm not going to be there the day that the temple is dedicated and the glory of God is going to fall so powerfully. Even the priests are not going to be able to minister because God is so present in that place." David's not going to get to see that. But David is going to get to set the stage for that. Do you know the fundamental change that's happening right here in David's life? David is going from being a hero to being a hero maker. I want you to let that one sink in. There's a fundamental transition that needs to happen, and it is a beautiful thing when it happens. When we stop thinking that we need to be the hero of the story, and we become hero makers. And we realize there's a generation coming along behind us, and they're going to need to stand on somebody's shoulders if they're going to reach further and have greater impact than we did. And we stop worrying about needing to be the star of the show, and we adopt a position of saying, let's help the generation that's coming behind us to extend this thing way beyond what we dreamed of doing, way beyond what we're going to be able to do. I'm curious, how many of you know who Mordecai Ham is? Raise your hand if you know who Mordecai Ham is. I was curious to see. Not a one in the room. Don't feel bad. Most people don't know who he is. He was an evangelist who ministered in the first half of the 20th century. He traveled around putting on meetings. And his name, like the names of so many others, would be lost to history except for one thing. In 1934, he was leading a revival meeting, and a young man got saved in that meeting by the name of Billy Graham. Mordecai Ham's ministry impacted somebody that nobody knew named Billy Graham. And Billy Graham not only came to know Christ, he started doing what he saw Mordecai Ham doing, going around leading these revival meetings. And today we can't count how many millions of people have come to know Christ because of the ministry, we would say, of Billy Graham. But with a little bit more insight, we would say because of the ministries of Billy Graham and Mordecai Ham, because Billy Graham stood on the shoulders of Mordecai Ham to do what he did. He witnessed somebody else doing this thing at one level, and he embraced the faith of this man that he listened to, who in the scope of history is a nobody. And yet, as he stepped into the position that God had assigned for him, we go, wow, how much God can do through one life surrendered, dedicated to him. And yet, the world needs Mordecai Hams, who may appear to be nobodies, but who position the next generation to stand on their shoulders. The Mordecai Hams of the world are the hero makers who elevate another generation. There are a lot of us in this room who need to be okay with the fact that, you know what? We may not live our lives in the spotlight. That isn't what matters. What matters is that we make an investment in the next generation. The passage that we read to begin with today about David being put on the sidelines as a warrior, but then we read about all these other battles that are fought, and what happens? Other younger leaders win great victories. And if you read the 2 chapters that follow that, what you discover is David was a master at identifying the next level of leaders. And it's really astounding, and there's an entire long chapter devoted to this, that David assembles the group of 3, the mighty men of renown, and this little circle of 30 who were very courageous. It's all these different little groups that he identifies and invests in, and then he lets them go out and lead in battle, and all the great victories that are won. What is David doing? He is making an impartation to them, and then he's freeing them up to lead. This takes some intentionality. It's part of why I believe so much in what we do around here in the 1 to 3 discipleship ministry, because we have a process where, I mean, it's one thing for us to sit here on a Sunday morning and go, yes, we need to make an investment in the next generation, but here's my question. So how do you do that? I mean, you personally. How are you going to impart something to the next generation? I get it. Those of us who are parents, well, we're going to do it through our kids. No, most of us aren't. This is kind of an awkward reality, and it's just the fact of the matter. The great likelihood is that the greatest ministry that God had planned for your life is probably not through what you impart to your kids. Our kids are important. We love them, and it is important what we impart to them, but the great likelihood is that your greatest contribution isn't going to be through your kids. It's going to be something else that you do, which should be liberating for some of us. Some of us ought to be going, whew, I hope so, because the jury's still out on some of that. How are you going to impart something to the next generation? That's part of why we believe so much in this 1 to 3 process. If you go, I don't know how to do that, let us help you. Commit 9 or 10 months to be a part of a group where you're going to be trained. You are going to be confident and comfortable. So when you turn around and spend 9 to 10 months investing in those coming behind you, you will know what you're doing. And with every year, you're going to get better at it. We want there to be a process where we intentionally empower the next generation to lead and make a difference in the world. And it is a good thing. There are a lot of people in this room who have done it or who are doing it, and I keep hearing people say, I haven't done anything that has impacted my life more than this process. That's a good thing. David knew how to pass that cycle along. And his story kind of concludes with a thought in 1 Chronicles 23:1, which says, when David was old and full of years, he made Solomon, his son, the king over Israel. Didn't wait till he was dead, and then it's like, well, by default, somebody's got to be king, so the son gets it. No. David's like, this is what we've been preparing for. We're not going to wait till I'm dead. You're the man. And David imparts all this stuff to him and says, now he's king. And the final word I'll say is this. Paul in Acts 13, when he's preaching, he says a word about David that I pray becomes what can be said of us. He says, now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. If you could have a one-liner sum up your life, don't you want that to be it? When Paul had served God's purpose for his generation, he laid down and went to sleep. When Jesse had served God's purpose for his generation, we buried him. When Sally had served their purpose for this generation, they went on to heaven. That's a great line. I hear people who get immobilized by, I just wish I knew God's purpose for my life. Wish I knew the thing that God created me for. Quit worrying about it. There isn't a thing that God created you for that's going to be like, whoo, I figured it out. There's going to be different things in different seasons. The key is what the focus of worship was today, is every day to be dedicated to God, surrendered to Him, that whatever God puts in front of me today, I'm going to embrace that. And I'll recognize in this season that there are some things that He has me focus on. But the key is Jesus is at the center of it all. I look around the room, and we've got a lot of different decades of life represented in the room. Whether you're young or old or somewhere in between, God wants to use you to make a difference. That's not just preacher talk. He wants you to impact lives. Do you know what He's called you to do right now? Would you join me as we turn to him together in prayer? Oh God, thank you so much that you honor us by calling us not only to your family, but to roles that make a real difference in the lives of others, roles that matter in the kingdom. And we want to embrace those. We want to step into those things. For some of us who maybe are at a place that you've been transitioning us and there are some gaps in our lives, or there need to be some gaps because we need to say no to some things, I pray that you would nudge us forward to recognize that you're not just closing out a chapter, that you're opening a new one. I pray that you would begin to open our eyes to see new opportunities, new relationships, new directions and ministries that you're calling us to. I pray, oh God, that you'd begin to put on our hearts the names and faces of people that you're calling us to draw closer to in relationships, to be able to sow things into the lives of others. Lord, we don't want to shrink back because ministry is time-consuming and inconvenient. We want to embrace all that you have for us. We want to surrender to everything that you've planned for us. When our time is done, we want it to be said of us that we fulfilled your purpose for our lives in this generation. Thanks for the privilege of knowing and serving you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I surely hope that what you heard was relevant and helpful, and above everything, I hope that what you experienced today really helped your heart to connect with the heart of God. Now, if what you heard for you stirred up any questions or maybe led you toward some type of spiritual decision, maybe you want to talk with someone about something that's on your mind, I would love to hear from you. And so I would encourage you, reach out by email. At the bottom of the screen, you see my email address. It's mark@myfreedomchurch.net. That's not going to go to a secretary or an assistant. That'll come directly to me. I'd love to hear from you and talk with you about anything that's on your mind. And if in the future you're in our area, we would love for you to come and worship with us at Freedom Church. But until then, we invite you to access all of the sermon material that you find online. Again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Hope that you have a great day.